Hey everyone, welcome to the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Very, very much looking forward to my conversation today with Gershon Baskin. We will talk with him in just a second. But first, thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe. And you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Gershon Baskin is an Israeli writer, columnist, author, and one of the most recognizable names in the Middle East peace process. He is the Middle East director of ICO, International Communities Organization, and is the director of the Holy Land Bond. And he is the co-founder and former co-director of the Israeli-Palestinian Center for Research and Information. During the premiership of the late Yitzhak Rabin, he served as a special advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to a secret team of intelligence officers established by Mr. Rabin. In 2011, after 5 years of negotiation with Hamas, he successfully brokered the release of abducted Israel Defense Forces soldier Gilad Shalit. Gershon, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to talking with you today because there's a lot going on right now in the world, which you are expert at. So let's jump right into it. Are you surprised at the level of protesting that you've been witnessing on college campuses across America?
Wow. I'm not there and I'm far away. And although I grew up as a Jew in America, I've been living in Israel for 46 years. I go back to America as a tourist. I did recently visit two campuses at Brown University and Wesleyan. I understand Brown is one of the places where there have been quite a lot of demonstrations. When I was there, I lectured together with a Palestinian colleague, and I saw Free Palestine posters around the campus, but no one demonstrated us, and there was no noise around us at all. We were welcomed and gave our lectures, both to the faculty and an open session to students that was online. So these demonstrations have sort of exploded all over America overnight. I think that part of the problem that we're witnessing is something that I've talked about for years, of a very big danger fostered by the American Jewish establishment and the state of Israel in equating legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Criticizing Israel is legitimate. Criticizing the occupation and Israel's policies on Palestine is completely legitimate. Anti-Semitism is illegitimate at all times, always, everywhere. There is no legitimate anti-Semitism. But if you create a situation where all criticism of Israel is called anti-Semitic, you have a difficult time discerning when it is really anti-Semitism. There's no doubt from what I see from here, from Israel, looking at the demonstration, that there is anti-Semitism there. But there's also a lot of legitimate criticism of Israel, of the war in Gaza, of what Israel has done in Gaza. And we can't figure out what's what, because the anti-Semitic noise has overtaken what is legitimate in criticizing Israel's policies in Gaza. So I suppose I'm surprised at the intensity of the demonstrations, but why not? When you don't see October 7th over and over again like we do in Israel, that's all we see in Israel is October 7th. What people around the world are seeing October 8th and onward now for 7 months of total destruction of Gaza and killing of so many innocent people in Gaza. So, and American bombs that are doing it. So I think the protests are understandable, and what's troubling is how it's also being exploited by anti-Semites.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said, and I agree with much of what you're saying. And, for me personally, I have no problem with protests. I'm a liberal. I'm a Democrat. I'm a patriot. I believe in free speech and the First Amendment and the right to assemble and all that. And I think I'm happy that college kids are protesting. I've been saying for years, it's like, come on, wake up. Like, be like your brethren from the 60s. We should have more protests. There's so many issues around the world and even at home.
Right.
The loss of reproductive rights. Like, where are those protests? But, and this is a big but, there has been And I wouldn't refer to it as so much as noise, as real harassment and threatening behavior from that anti-Semitic side, and the confluence of things that I think has just added to the challenges of discussing this kind of conflict. Clearly college students and others are expressing outrage over the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. But there's been horrible oppression and persecution and violence and or genocide in places like Sudan, Syria, Yemen, against the Uyghurs in China, Russia's 2-year bombardment in Ukraine and elsewhere. So why do you think this particular conflict is resonating so much with college students when we have not seen them engaged and enraged over what's been happening elsewhere?
Right. Of course, they should be enraged of what happened in Syria and in Iraq and in China and in South Sudan. And you can go back to wherever you want to, Rwanda. And one of my good Palestinian friends said to me decades ago, we Palestinians are so lucky that you Jews are our enemy, because if you weren't, no one would know about our struggle. So there is something poignant here about the Jewish people being the enemy of the Palestinian people. Israel has always gotten a disproportionate share of the news. Maybe it's because many of the news media in America in particular has a lot of Jewish influence and Jewish money behind it. And I don't want to sound like an anti-Semite myself, but let's face it.
Be careful now.
I'm being really careful here, but Jews do have a disproportionate amount of influence in the United States, in particular, whether it be in the world of banking and finance or in Hollywood or in other places. Jews have excelled, and they're a very small part of the American population, yet we have a much bigger share of influence within American society, American media. Even in language, you hear so many Yiddish words have entered into the American English language. Sometimes when I listen to American media, I'm taken back when some non-Jewish newscaster on MSNBC throws in some word in Yiddish, and it's just part of normal speech. So I don't know if that's an explanation. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is targeted more than other conflicts. That's a fact. Israel has also received a disproportionate of support from the United States of America over the last decades. Look at how much foreign aid the United States gives to Israel above every other country. So I think that it is natural when that happens, for Americans, Jewish or not Jewish, to ask questions of the American government. Why are we giving so much money to the state of Israel? And when it has been an answer in the past that we have shared values, when you look at what Israel is doing in Gaza, are those shared values of the United States? Of course, America has done this in Iraq and in other places, but Americans sort of put themselves outside of that picture. But it's very difficult to look at those pictures and know that it's your taxpayer dollars that are funding it.
Yeah, no, there's certainly a validity to the point that there is government engagement in Israel, government support. But I just as a human, I have a problem saying, okay, if my government isn't part of it, I don't really care. I'm not going to be out there protesting.
You're 100% right.
People can die in Darfur, and as long as Israel's not a part of it, America's not a part of it, I'm not going to be out there protesting.
You're 100% correct. There are so many injustices in the world, and so many places where terrible things are happening to people that particularly young people, college students, should care about them and should be out demonstrating. Sometimes we demonstrate for the right causes and end up with bad results. I remember as a university student demonstrating against the Shah of Iran. Was that a mistake?
But this gets us back to that word that you used before that is going to come up a lot in our conversation today. Anti-Semitism. Is it possible that that's the difference here? That when yes, Jews have a disproportionate influence on lots of things. It's not because of any nefarious purpose, because they're just an overachieving member of our society. But is anti-Semitism at the root of this? Is that why college kids and professors and academia cares so much because Jews are an easy target, always have been throughout history?
I hope not. I don't really think that it is. I mean, we saw at Columbia University and other places, Jews in the protest grounds holding a Seder Pesach. We have organizations that are anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, but they're Jewish, like Jewish Voices for Peace. I know I've met at college campuses around the United States, Israeli and Jewish members of Students for Justice in Palestine.
Sure. Look, there are protests and have been going on for a long time in Israel. But I think at the end of the day, much of those people, I won't say all of them, my sense is most of them would still die for their country. They still believe in Israel. They may not believe in Netanyahu and some of the policies. They may be anti-war, but they're not anti-Semitic. I think it's something different happening in this country.
And as I said, anti-Semitism is illegitimate always in every place. And I would hope that those students who are protesting for a just cause, for the liberation and freedom for the Palestinian people, understand that they need to separate and condemn the anti-Semites within their midst and not be part of that. They have a responsibility. There's a very well-known Palestinian who's originally from Gaza, from Khan Yunis, who lives in California and has been very prominent since October 7th on Twitter, or X, what do you want to call it? Ahmed Khatib, he's a very good friend of mine, and he has publicly condemned over and over the anti-Semitism and the ignorance within the protest movements in the campuses. And he himself says, when you say free Palestine, or from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, he asks, what about the Jews and their right to exist in that land? A very good Palestinian friend of mine, Samer Sinjalawi, who's written in the New York Times recently, says that we as Palestinians have to recognize that the Jewish people have a connection to the land of Israel, and they were always there. But the Jewish people need to also understand that they were never there alone. And there were always others in the land, and we are the others today who are in this land. So there needs to be a recognition of both people of the right to exist within this land. There is no from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. Palestinians need to have freedom and liberation and dignity. Palestinians need to know that they won't get freedom, liberation, and dignity if Israel doesn't have security. And Israel won't have security unless the Palestinian people have freedom, liberty, and dignity. Well, there's an equation here that we have to deal with, that we need to recognize each other's rights to be here and figure out how we're going to share this land. And those people who say from the river to the sea, we need to ask them, first of all, I've seen it on television, ask them what river and what sea are you talking about? Because many of them don't even know where it is. And the others, really, well, let's really sit down and talk about this and understand what this conflict is about.
Do you... I feel like I could already talk to you for the next 10 hours. So I'm like trying to figure out where to go next because I have so much to ask you. But so with from the river to the sea, do you think that American college students are just truly so misguided as to what that truly means when you have people that are marching against what they believe is genocide, shouting chants that literally mean the genocide of Jews and the annihilation of Israel?
That's really problematic. But, you know, as a Jew and as an Israeli, I point the finger of accusation first at my own government, because our government and people within our government and our politics have given credibility to the case that South Africa brought against Israel in the International Court of Justice. We have ministers in our government. Just the other day, our Minister of Finance talked about wiping out Rafah. Wiping it out.
Sure, that's horrible.
These are genocidal terms that are being fostered by people in our government. We have a well-known and respected, strangely, expert on Arab affairs on Channel 13, who's now moving over to I-24, Tzvi Yechezkeli, who said at the beginning of the war, we need to kill 100,000 of the Gazans. There's a guy who has a public voice on the media. So when you look at the Convention Against Genocide, which is a international legal document, the convention itself talks about intent. And the evidence that was brought by South Africa to the International Court of Justice was one piece of evidence after the other of Israelis, Minister of Defense, the Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff of the Army, members of Knesset, and other irresponsible people who showed intent of genocide. Now, obviously, Israel is not committing genocide in Gaza. We who have experienced genocide know how it can be an extermination machine. It was done to us. We would certainly know how to do it to others much more efficiently. So Israel is not committing genocide, but there is the letter of the law. And the question of intent is genuine. So we need to be very careful of what we say and what we do. And that goes home first to us here in Israel. And I would challenge people who say that Israel is committing genocide, not on the legal grounds and what the convention is, but in the reality, the fact that there are 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, the fact that there are 400,000 residents who are Palestinians of Israel's capital in Jerusalem, and albeit they don't have citizenship and they don't have equality, no one is committing genocide against them. There is a war in Gaza, and Israel has killed too many innocent people. Too many women and children have been killed in this war by indiscriminate bombing. And I question seriously whether or not some of these actions committed by Israel are not in the realm of being war crimes. That needs to be investigated, and we need to investigate it. We have a responsibility to ourselves, who we claim we have the highest moral army in the world, which I think is non-existent. There is no such thing as a moral army in the world. Armies are engaged in killing, and killing is not moral. So I think these are problematic, but I think there's a lot of things that can be said to a lot of people in the protests about the slogans that they're adopting, and whether or not they are suggesting that the Jewish people don't have a right to a state of their own. I think it's a legitimate question. I think it's a question that can be asked, and we can discuss it and debate it, and we don't even have to agree on it. I think it is legitimate to question when a state is legitimate or not legitimate, but to look at other states also as well. Is Syria a legitimate state? Is Iraq a legitimate state?
America. I'm sure the Native Americans would have a strong opinion on that one.
Oh, I'm sure, for sure, definitely. So I think these questions are legitimate, and it starts with education, and it starts with challenging people's assumptions and making a case. I think that Israel has a moral right to exist. I don't think any other country of the world is asked the question if a country has a moral right to exist. We are asked that question. I think we need to provide answers for it. But it also requires us to act morally.
Sure.
And we have done with regard to the Palestinian people does not meet the challenge.
You mentioned the term war crimes. It sounds like you're concerned. You suspect they may have been committed. But where are you on?
I'm being careful.
Well, my job is to make sure you're not careful, that you answer the questions. But I understand where you're coming from. But in your opinion, is this something not only that should be investigated, which I personally 100% agree with, but has that actually happened so far?
Have the war crimes happened, or have
there been war crimes committed? I believe there's been war crimes committed, obviously, by Hamas, but they're not a nation state, and that's a whole different conversation. But
I think they have to be held accountable as well in the international court.
But to the claim that Israel has committed war crimes, is that something you agree with, or you're concerned about it and think it needs to be investigated?
I think we have committed war crimes in Gaza. I think we have. I think it needs to be investigated first by ourselves. But quite frankly, in looking at our history of investigation of suspected war crimes, we usually just acquit ourselves. We conduct an investigation which under international law, it prevents it from going to the International Criminal Court, because it's built into the whole legal system that if a country has an independent judiciary and actually investigates itself, then it doesn't come to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. One of the ironies of the attempted judicial reform, so-called reform in Israel, that ended on October 7th, was the attempt of the current Israeli government to remove the independence of the judiciary,
Right.
which would have put us in direct conflict with international law and would have given jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court.
Mm-hmm.
So that did not happen. And as the United States has said, as Secretary Biden has said, that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over Israel. I'm not sure that's true, because I don't believe that the investigations that the state of Israel conducts on all accusations of war crimes are actually real investigations.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen too many soldiers and officers simply acquitted or given a slap on the wrist, nothing real. So yeah, I think there are problems here.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to note that Israel, China, Russia, and the United States are not they're not members of the ICC.
That doesn't mean that they're not under the jurisdiction of the ICC.
No, I'm just saying that there's...
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's a
America
fact.
and Israel and other countries have not signed the Treaty of Rome,
Mm-hmm.
Which would give us membership in the International
Mm-hmm.
Criminal Court. But they can still issue warrants of arrest against
Mm-hmm.
Israeli leaders,
Mm-hmm.
Officers and soldiers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, you used another word before. I'm all about words, and I think words are incredibly important because words have consequences. You used the word intent. I could agree with you, just sitting here today, that probably there's been some war crimes committed. But I think the bigger issue, the bigger question for me as just a person, as a Jew, as someone who's watching this incredibly complicated, nuanced, centuries-year-old conflict, putting aside certain rogue individuals who may or may not have power within the actual government. I mean, we see that in this country. We see Trump. I mean, my God, what Trump has done when he was president, what he would do again, who his henchmen are, what they've, we just had an article in Time magazine where he's telegraphing pretty much autocracy for the next 4 years. But
Right.
is it a fair statement to make that Israel's intent was and is to commit war crimes?
No, I don't think it's a right statement that Israel's intent was to create war crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But I do strongly believe that a lot of what has happened over the last 7 months has been about revenge. And there has been an intent of revenge.
And Netanyahu's own self-preservation is behind some of that too.
Oh, for sure. That's a whole different issue. But I think that we were so traumatized on October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
The more Jews were killed in one place at one time since the Holocaust on October 7th. And what we believed, that someone had our back, someone was guarding us, someone was protecting us. The state of Israel was created to be a safe haven for Jews. That all collapsed on October 7th. Mm-hmm. And we're still living the trauma. And that trauma sparked a desire for revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of this war over the last 7 months has not been strategic. It has simply been to extract revenge on those who have done it to us. And you hear the voices within the Israeli society and the Israeli politics that there are no innocent people in Gaza. They all supported what Hamas did on October 7th. Mm-hmm. They all wanted it. And in my mind, no child is responsible for what their parents did. And all the non-combatants in Gaza are not guilty of what Hamas did. Mm-hmm. And we have mounting numbers of deaths, estimated to be above 40,000 today. And not only that, we've probably killed a lot of the Israeli hostages in Gaza with our own bombs, because underneath the rubble of those buildings that we have demolished, there had to be also hostages. Mm-hmm. So they were in homes. We know they were in homes. They haven't been in bunkers and tunnels this whole time. At the beginning months of the war, they were in people's homes around the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm. Another thing you mentioned before, which really resonates with me, is this cognitive dissonance between October 7th and October 8th. And you see that on college campuses. October 7th, 1,200 innocent Israeli men, women, children, babies were slaughtered, as you rightly pointed out, in the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. 240 hostages, Israeli and American hostages. We're taken into Gaza
from 30 different countries.
Yeah,
not just.
But
America.
we hear nothing of that day from the protesters in the United States right now on college campuses. Nothing about the hostages, nothing about the American. You could be anti-Semitic all you want, but these are American hostages. I think 5 of them that are still there, likely under horrific circumstances. Why is that? Why is there silence on the suffering of Jews? Why isn't that part of the conversation? Why isn't that part of these demonstrations?
I don't know. I don't have an answer. I know
But is
that
the answer the one we don't want to hear? The one you hoped was in existence?
maybe I don't know.
Is
but
it anti-Semitism?
The other side of the picture is that here in Israel, from the Israeli media, we hear nothing about October 8th and onwards. We see the physical damage, and we see almost nothing of the humanitarian suffering in Gaza.
Sure, that's just as bad.
October 7th, over and over and over again, every single day we're repeating October 7th. So I don't know why Israel has not succeeded, or the Jewish community has not succeeded in keeping the issue of the hostages alive in American society. I think it's disgusting and disgracious when we see pictures of people removing pictures of hostages around New York City or other towns and cities around the United States. It's atrocious. But by the way, the hostage issue has become politicized in Israel. And we have people from the right-wing Bibi supporters in Israel who are removing posters of hostages around Israel today, because working to free the hostages today is associated with being on the left or wanting to capitulate to Hamas. Whereas if we want to go into Rafah and kill more Palestinians, you're behind the government, and this is what the right wing wants to do. So this issue has become politicized, even in Israel, in this country. I saw last night, I was driving home from the demonstration that we went to for the hostages in Jerusalem last night, and saw a big poster that says, Rafah now. We have to go in and kill more people now. So it's complicated and it's ugly. And there are a lot of things that are almost impossible to understand.
Is that part of the problem, that it is so complicated? It is so convoluted and ugly, that there's this incredible lack and appreciation for that history and context on college campuses today, that we're reducing what people, what perhaps young people are seeing in that part of the world right now, and isolating it from everything else that is connected to it. And that's what has some people outraged on both sides. Because certainly if you just look in a vacuum of what's happened post-October 7th, and you don't look at October 7th, and you don't look at, attacks coming from Hezbollah in the north, if you don't look at attacks coming from Iran, if you don't look at the 73 war, if you don't look at the 67 war, if you don't look at the war in 48, if you don't look at the Holocaust and the pogroms and Kristallnacht and yada, 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 you see where I'm going here. You can finish the sentence. If you don't look at any of that, then my God, this is atrocious. And if you protest in the streets about just that part, you could seem as righteous as ever. But when you lack that context from October 7th prior, to me, you just seem foolish. You could be as altruistic as you want. You could have good intentions. You could hate what you see happening in Gaza, like I do. But you seem foolish. You seem misguided.
Yeah. Before the war, when I spoke on campuses across the United States, inevitably students would ask me, what can we do? What can we do to help? One of the things that I say is, first of all, don't be ignorant. Read, learn, ask questions, read stuff you don't agree with. The second thing I would say to them is don't import the conflict to your campus. That's insane. If you support Israel, find a way to support Israel. If you support Palestine, find a way to support Palestine. Importing the conflict to your campus is insane. What are you fighting over here? Figure out the best way to help the side that you want to help, and help them. And if you're really smart and willing to take on a challenge, talk to the people on the other side. Because the best thing that you can do is work with people who support the other side to help find a way to peace. Ultimately, that's what we need to achieve. These two people living in this land, no one's going anywhere. We have to figure out how to share it. And importing the conflict and fighting over the turf of the land of Israel, the land of Palestine, from Columbia University just seems to me to be completely meshugana.
I agree. And you get to use that term for sure because you're Jewish. So let's talk about the Cairo talks.
Majnun in Arabic, majnun.
We all ultimately, at the end of the day, we all speak the same language, right?
Right.
And that is actually, and all kidding aside, that is the ultimate point. We are all humans. We all bleed red blood. We all breathe and breathe the same air and drink the same water. Well, maybe not the same water, especially if you go to Mexico on vacation. But so let's talk about the ceasefire deal on the table, which Secretary Anthony Blinken has said is extremely generous. That's been backed up by Lord Cameron in England. And it does seem like a good deal. Is that going to happen?
First of all, to me, it seems like a bad deal.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Why? Because it's only talking about bringing part of the hostages home. 33 of them is the number that's been thrown out, when we know there are 132 hostages at home, and there is no good deal that doesn't bring all the hostages home. So that's the first thing I would say.
I agree with that.
The second thing is that all the compliments about generosity and all are part of the noise of the negotiations themselves and have very little to do with the actual negotiations, of which the public has almost no idea of what's really on the table. There's a lot of information, misinformation, and disinformation around negotiations. That's simply the reality of how these kind of negotiations work, particularly in a situation where the two parties to the negotiations don't even talk to each other. Not only don't they talk to each other, they're each committed to killing the other. So it's a very bizarre negotiation.
Is something better than nothing, though? Is that?
Something is better than nothing, and every hostage who can be brought home should be brought home. This was a big mistake of Israel back in November when it decided that the Hamas breach of the agreement by not continuing to release women and children, it required Israel to restart the war rather than extending the ceasefire for 4 days and getting more hostages home. Women, children, elderly, sick, wounded, whoever they were willing to release, Israel should have continued the ceasefire then and got as many of them out as possible back in November. I think what we're stuck on right now is that Hamas has made it very clear from day one that it has a red line, and that red line is not being crossed by the Israelis. So we have a deadlock situation, and it doesn't matter how generous the offer of Israel is going to be. And by the way, it wasn't an Israeli offer, it's an Egyptian proposal, that the Egyptians were here for 3 days with their head of Central Intelligence and their whole team putting pressure on Israel, and Israel agreed to a deal, which is a very general deal. It doesn't really get into all the details. We don't know all the details yet. But Hamas's red line, which Israel has not crossed, is to end the war. Netanyahu has called this a delusional idea. Quite frankly, I don't find anything delusional about it. They want to end the war. They want the war to end. Of course, our problem is that the government of Israel has failed to generate any political endgame here that would replace Hamas with something else, with someone else. And Netanyahu has refused to do that. So the ending of the war basically means that Hamas remains in Gaza. And that for Israel is bad. I think it's bad for the Palestinians. I think it's bad for the region. But our government has failed to put a political alternative on the table because Netanyahu has developed his whole strategy since 2009 not to have any legitimate Palestinian alternative, so as to be able to say to the whole world, we want peace, but they don't. Look at who's there, Hamas and the illegitimate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That doesn't work anymore. Hamas, I believe, where we're stuck today, and this is just a guess, an educated guess, because I've spoken to Hamas leaders for 18 years, is, you know, you'll hear a lot in the media that Hamas wants international guarantees that the war will end. And apparently Blinken has told the Egyptians, and the Egyptians have told Hamas, that get into the ceasefire, whether it be for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or longer, it will end with the end of the war. And people are saying Hamas wants guarantees. That, quite frankly, there are no guarantees that anyone could give that Israel would end the war. I believe that what Hamas wants is for Benjamin Netanyahu to stand up and say that the war is over.
Right, you tweeted that this morning.
The ultimate humiliation and the ultimate defeat from Hamas of Israel. And that's my guess. I might be wrong, but this is my sense of what Hamas wants to hear. And they're not going to hear it from Netanyahu. And the question is Netanyahu going to allow the war to continue and to sacrifice the hostages?
But you see, this is the real. You're hitting on something which really strikes a chord with me, because this, I think, is at the root of the problem. You mentioned Egyptian officials were in Israel for 3 days, hammering at Netanyahu and the government. You got to do something. You got to do something. Biden has been doing the same thing. Blinken has been doing the same thing. Who does that with Hamas?
Oh, the Egyptians have been spending the last week doing this with
okay,
Hamas.
But you see, I have 2 ears. Clearly, Biden has been listening, right? Clearly, Israel is listening. But is anyone ever going to get Hamas to listen?
Well,
isn't that the problem?
There are basically 2 countries that have leverage over Hamas, and these are the 2 mediators, Qatar and Egypt. Egypt and Israel are much more aligned in their view of Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
We have mutual interest with Egypt in terms of ensuring that Hamas does not continue to control the Gaza Strip. And the Egyptians have been leveraging whatever leverage they have over Hamas very strongly. Hamas leadership outside of Gaza apparently has agreed to the deal. And they themselves have been trying to put pressure on the Hamas leadership inside of Gaza, underground inside of Gaza, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and the other members of the Politburo of Hamas who are in Gaza. But these are tough cookies. They're really people who see the world very differently than you and I, and perhaps even the Hamas leadership who's living in luxury far away from Gaza, in Doha. And these are people who are not afraid to die. In fact, they believe it's a commandment to die.
Sure.
They expect to die. They expect to kill as many Jews as they can along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And surrender is not part of their vocabulary or their mindset. What they do want to see is Israel defeated. And, I think back to 1975, when Henry Kissinger, who was someone who fought long, hard years for American interest in Vietnam and other places and developed the whole domino theory against communism and all, understood in 1975 that the United States needed to declare victory and go home. Everyone knew that the United States did not win the war in Vietnam. The United States lost. 60,000 American soldiers were killed in Vietnam. But it was a war that could not be won. Israel cannot defeat Hamas by the sword. There is no military victory over Hamas. There is only a political victory over Hamas. And that victory is, in fact, the materialization of the 2-state solution that gives Israel the right to exist and Palestine the right to exist. That is the ultimate defeat of Hamas, because that's what they've been about, fighting against giving away any part of Palestine. Forcing the 2-state solution on the Israeli and Palestinian people is the ultimate defeat of the extremist in Israel and the extremist in Palestine.
Is that ultimately, in theory, I agree with you. There's a part of me that's so kumbaya, even though I believe in it myself as the ultimate,
it's the ultimate unkumbaya, because there are huge challenges in making it real. So no one is suggesting that the Israeli army go home and we stop defending ourselves. No one is suggesting that there won't be enemies who will want to kill us. But if Palestinians don't achieve the same rights that the Israeli people have, the right to self-determination, freedom and liberty, we will go on fighting this war forever.
But knowing that forces, extremist forces, radical terrorist forces like Hamas and Hezbollah and so forth, don't ever want that. How long could that kind of 2-state government situation truly exist before another 2006-like event with Hamas, where all of a sudden the extremists are taking over again?
Look, it depends how it's done.
Because they don't want peace with Israel.
No, they don't. And the extremists in Israel don't want peace with the Palestinians. We've heard our Minister of National Security and our Minister of Finance talk about it creating a situation where we're going to expel the Palestinians from Palestine. Smotrich or Ben-Gvir, one of them said, we need Nakba 2.0. These are the kind of crazy people we have on our side. We need to be wiser than we were in Oslo. Oslo was a very naive process. There's nothing naive about peacemaking. You have to be really smart, and you have to build it in a way that protects us. It has to be benchmarked. It has to be monitored. We and Israel and the Palestinians signed 6 agreements and breached every single one of the agreements we signed. We need third-party monitors and verifiers of agreements that what we agree to is being implemented before we take additional steps that are being that put unreasonable risks on us, on our security, on our lives. We need to begin the process by confronting the issue of education and incitement. In Oslo, education and incitement was an afterthought. We need to begin there because it turns out that what you teach your children is what you really care about. And if we in Israel and in Palestine don't look at what we teach our children, we will never have peace. So we need to first foundation stone of a genuine peace process will be when we agree to confront what we teach our children. And lastly, this is not a bilateral process. We saw on the night when Iran sent hundreds of missiles to Israel that there was a regional defense alliance that worked. Mm-hmm. And the Israeli-Palestinian process needs to be a regional process where we will create a new architecture of security, stability, and economic development for the region, beginning with the states that we have peace with, and including the Saudis, who are key here, key for the reconstruction of Gaza. But we need to look at this in a regional context, mm-hmm. not led by the United States, mm-hmm. led by the region, with the United States and the European Union and the Chinese and the Japanese and others supporting us. But this needs to be homegrown, mm-hmm. coming from here, where we have allies in this region who don't want Iran to be the influential country in the region, who don't want extremists to take us over, who do believe in a demilitarized Palestinian state, who want to see a different Israel living within this region.
Again, there's so much. I'm writing down notes I have to ask you. As someone who has, in my life, I say this as someone who in my lifetime has seen enough for me to believe and agree with those who say, if the other side laid down its weapons, we'd have no more war. If Israel laid down its weapons, we'd have no more Israel. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, no, because when you look at it from the Palestinian side, the Palestinians said, when we're not violent, they don't confront us because they don't have to. And when we are violent, they don't confront us because we're violent. So the Palestinians have experienced now 76 years of living with the reality of Israel, mm-hmm. and never finding the path to get Israel to recognize their existence and their right to self-determination, to their right for a state of themselves. And I talk about 76 years and not the 56 years or 57 years of the occupation, because we Israelis and we Palestinians need to recognize that all the land between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, is the land of Israel, and all the land between the river and the sea is Palestine. And for us Jews, when we read the Torah every Shabbat, the stories that we read are not taking places on the beaches of Tel Aviv. They're taking place on the hillsides and the valleys of Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And when Palestinians in the world think about Palestine, they're not just thinking about Nablus, Jenin, and Tulkarem. They're thinking about Ramle, Haifa, Akko, and Lod, places inside of Israel. Now, we need to come to terms with that. Even if the two-state solution partitions the land into two separate states, we will always feel part of the whole place. We define ourselves by it. We give our identity to it, and so do the Palestinians. So this is the challenge here of recognizing the legitimacy of the narrative of the other side, not agreeing with it, because it's almost impossible for us to agree to it, but we need to recognize that there is another people here who have another story, another narrative, another culture, another religion, another justice. These are big tasks. The task of reconciliation takes much longer than the task of negotiating a peace agreement and signing a piece of paper. But this is what we have to aim toward. This is what we have to understand. And the one thing that enables us to get there, which is completely absent, is compassion. Mm-hmm. We have no compassion for the pain and suffering of the other side because they've done it to us. We have to recognize that we've done it to them too. Mm-hmm. And both sides need to have a bit of compassion to begin with, and it has to be expanded over time. Empathy and compassion. These are really hard things to deal with in real life and death situations.
Monumental.
Which is what we have here.
And I think that's what's lost on America's youth. some of us who are older, I'm 64, so I remember a lot of shit. So life isn't as simple to me as it might be to someone who's 20, someone who grew up thinking, wow, black presidents, what's everybody bitching about? We don't have racism in America, right? Like, imagine if your first president, your awareness of American government and politics is a black president. It's going to change your whole perspective on things, right? But if you were called a fucking Jew bastard when you were 9, like I was, and maybe just a half a mile from the Holocaust, which it was in 1959 when I was born, maybe you have a different perspective. And so I think there's the perspective on college campuses today is lacking. To some college students today, the biggest rivalry they've ever experienced is Army and Navy, like the college football games. Like, what you're talking about is what I keep saying, is that this shit goes back centuries. There are textbooks. There's indoctrination on both sides because of the feeling of existential threat, of survival or lack thereof. It is so complicated. I'm not on one side or the other, but I have strong opinions, but I do think that what saves me from losing my mind is understanding that this is a complicated, very nuanced historical conflict, and that both sides have legitimate gripes, and we need to find a solution that satisfies both gripes. And that just seems lost to me on the campuses today.
Yeah, it probably is. I grew up like you in America. I was born in '56, so I'm a few years older than you. I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. Even when we moved to a less Jewish neighborhood, I was involved with the Zionist youth movement, so all my closest friends were Jews. I never experienced anti-Semitism, but as a youngster growing up, I was marching with the civil rights movement and marching with the anti-Vietnam War movement, and that was part of my political identity. I've never experienced in my life directly anti-Semitism, which perhaps gives me a different perspective on anti-Semitism in life. My sense of Judaism and my sense of belonging has always been from the positive side, not from the negative side. I read all the Elie Wiesel books, and I did, and God knows how many Holocaust books I read. I can't do Holocaust tourism. I can't. Poland is a big empty space on my map of countries in Europe because I feel that I can't go to Poland without doing the Holocaust tourism, and I don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. I've done it enough, but that's not where my Jewish identity comes from, or my Israeli identity comes from. But still, I have seen in my life that the divisions within my own society are not between left and right, but between those who can imagine a future where we live in peace and those who cannot. Mm-hmm. And that's not left and right. It crosses those lines. And I think it has to do with people's personal experiences. Look, we have so many bereaved families in Israel. I always ask the question, why does one bereaved family come out and join the Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Families Forum? And why does one join the what's it called, the something against terrorism, Jews against terrorism, or something like that? What these are people who experienced in their own lives someone very close to them, a parent, a child, a brother, a sister was killed, and they come out with completely different conclusions. One says, I'm going to work with people on the other side who experienced the same thing I did, because I understand their humanity in the way that they understand my humanity. And other people come out and say, I want revenge. Mm-hmm. I want to kill them because they killed me. Mm-hmm. And this is the division in the world that I see. And as I said, there are Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families working together, and there are Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families who want to kill each other.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about all of the death in Gaza, how much of that blame should be put on Hamas? And I'm not saying this excuses Israel, which some people are doing. They're saying, like, this is all Hamas's fault, not Israel's fault. But isn't Hamas to blame for so much of that as well?
Definitely. Hamas are irresponsible. They've been irresponsible all these years. My hope, and I have said this to Palestinian friends, and I've written about this, is that at the end of the day, the Palestinian people need to conduct, whether it be historical or in real time, a trial of crimes against the Palestinian people and put the Hamas leaders on trial. This takes me back to something that even Arafat said in the old days, and Mahmoud Abbas said it many times to me personally. He said, you Israelis need to make Hamas our problem. The more Hamas is your problem, the stronger they get, because the harder you hit them, the more they grow. Hamas is our problem. We need to deal with them. And I believe that very strongly. Hamas needs to be put on trial in a Palestinian court for crimes against the Palestinian people.
That wouldn't fit the narrative, though, would it?
We need to write a new narrative. And quite frankly, we need to take responsibility for the horrors that we've done in Gaza as well.
Sure.
There's no excuse for demolishing 70% of Gaza. There's no excuse. I'm sorry that we can't forgive ourselves and make excuses for what we've done.
So a lot of the protesters are calling for President Biden and the United States to end military aid. Now, you were mentioning before, that part of the world. Isn't a stabilized Middle East where Iran isn't at the hub of the center of power in that region? When I hear the protesters say things like that, it strikes me that they think that we're just sending money to Israel because we like Jews and not having any connection whatsoever to our own geopolitical strategy, military strategy, how important it is not to have a destabilized Middle East and what that would mean to America. Isn't that subject also extremely complicated? Like, you just can't cut off aid to Israel. That hurts America.
First of all, the strength of Iran today is largely the consequence of Netanyahu and Trump removing the United States from the nuclear agreement with Iran. This was one of the biggest errors that was ever made strategically by the United States and Israel, pushed by Netanyahu, because it was not a perfect agreement. But once the United States withdrew from the agreement, Iran was free to move ahead with its nuclear program. I still don't believe that they have made a decision to build a bomb, because it's just not logical that a 40-year nuclear program has not produced a bomb when Pakistan did it and North Korea did it, and countries that are much less sophisticated engineering-wise and scientific-wise than Iran. So I believe they haven't made the decision to make a bomb. They're on the verge of a bomb, but they're not there yet. Secondly, if I can recall the question again.
It's just about, it's easy. It's like the defund the police movement of a couple of years ago.
No, so here I think that the United States needs to put an end to the war in Gaza. And it needs to say to Israel, we have sent you the last shipment of bombs. With a caveat, if you are attacked by Hezbollah, if you are attacked by Iran, we would obviously renew that. But we have now decided to stop fueling the war in Gaza. Now, you in Israel need to do your bomb calculations of how much you need to stockpile to protect yourselves, but we're not giving you the offensive ability to continue this war. It needs to end. We think you need to put a political plan on the table to end the war, and you have not done that. With this, and the Biden doctrine has been out there, and I think it's a good doctrine, and Israel is at fault for not adopting it. But I think the United States could end this war within a week, and it should.
I want to get back to something we were talking about before, because I think this is so important to me, and it's something I would hope my listeners who happen to be progressives and on the far left and, kind of belong to that, Israel bad, everything else good camp. Is it fair to ask people to understand where all of this comes from? I'm just putting aside the Palestinian side right now. I'm talking just from Israel. And I can abhor Netanyahu and others in that country who are far right and are causing what I consider to be extreme, dangerous, damaging landscape right now. But is it fair to expect people like you who live there, not here, people who watch the Iron Dome bring down the missiles, are not watching it on their laptops at Starbucks on the Upper West Side. Okay? People who
Yeah.
are literally there and have been there, people who live that existential threat to their life every single day. Is there some part of that that we here in America and the rest of the world should be saying, we get it. We may not like it. We may think it's horrible. Maybe even maybe some of it even smacks of war crimes. But we understand when people have had a noose around their neck for centuries, which you can't argue the Jews haven't had. We get it. It's about survival. We may not like their methods of survival, but we can at least understand where it's coming from.
I see what you're saying, but I would question the general assumption. And in my view, the Palestinian issue has not been an existential threat to Israel militarily. It is an existential threat to Israel in terms of how we define ourselves. And we define ourselves as a democratic nation state of the Jewish people. And when we occupy the land between the river and the sea, there's no longer a Jewish majority in the land between the river and the sea. And the Palestinian people who we occupy don't enjoy democracy. So our own self-definition as the democratic nation state of the Jewish people is a lie to ourselves. They have not threatened us existentially. They were never a threat to us existentially. Even on October 7th, they were not an existential threat to the state of Israel. They were an existential threat to the people who were killed, obviously. But as a nation, the only existential threat that we have faced is that we are destroying ourselves as we define ourselves by our inability to end our occupation over the Palestinian people. That's our existential threat. And this requires self-criticism. We need to be critical of what we've done over all these years and all the opportunities that we have missed. And they have been a very difficult neighbor. They have cooperated with us all too well in keeping the occupation going. They bear a lot of responsibility for their own situation. They have adopted what we did for 2,000 years, a position of victimhood. The great thing about the Zionist movement was when Jews stood up and said, we're not going to be victims anymore. We're going to take charge of our history. History is not what's done to us. History is what we do for ourselves. And the Palestinian people need to do that as well. They need to stop playing victim. They need to take responsibility for themselves. They need to stand up and say, if we want to be free, we have to recognize that the Jewish people are here in this land and they have a right to be here. This is a challenge for them, but that's how I see it. And it doesn't really look at it from the same perspective that you do, because my assumptions are different.
Well, I don't think I have that much of a different perspective. It's just like if somebody breaks into your house 20 times and beats the shit out of you, and then all of a sudden, a week later, someone else knocks on your door and you open them up, and you might just punch that person in the face just because of what's happened to you 20 other times. Doesn't mean you're justified. It just means like, okay, we get it. The person was terrified that maybe this is going to be the 21st incident. But I'm not excusing it. I just want to be clear. I'm not excusing it, and I agree basically with what you just said.
Palestinian terrorism has been horrific. There's no question about it. They have killed innocent people over and over again over decades. But when we come up with the appropriate Zionist response to Palestinian terrorism, is we take more land away from Palestinian landowners and build settlements on their land, that destroys us. It doesn't build us. And that's the reason, by the way, that I can no longer call myself a Zionist, because too many things are done in the name of Zionism that I abhor, that I'm against, that I think are wrong. When I made Aliyah to Israel 46 years ago, my understanding of Zionism was very different. Now, maybe the problem is with me and not what Zionism was or is. But it's very clear today that the Zionist response to Palestinian terrorism is making Palestinians suffer.
You say you can't in good conscience be a Zionist, but you believe in the state of Israel. You believe in the existence
I'm an Israeli.
Yes.
I'm an Israeli citizen, and I'm proud.
Is there a confusion, at least in my country, about what it means to be a Zionist? Because I think a common perception is, in order to believe in the existence of the state of Israel, you have to be a Zionist.
Right. I was a hardcore Zionist when I was a kid. I take words to heart, and when I was an activist in the Zionist youth movement, for me, Zionism was making aliyah. If you're a Zionist, you move to Israel. There are no Zionists in the diaspora. You could be a supporter of Israel, you could be a lover of Israel, but a Zionist moves to Israel. Now, I don't know what the definition of Zionism is today. I know that's what's done in the name of Zionism is not me. And I don't know what people who call themselves Zionist in America think it means. If it means that the Jewish people have a legitimate right to a nation state of their own, then I can accept that, if that's what Zionism means. But Zionism, in my book, is not occupying the Palestinian people and preventing them from having liberation, or taking Palestinian land, or building settlements in the occupied territory, or killing Palestinians. That's not Zionism, or that shouldn't be Zionism. And if it is, then I am not.
Are you hopeful for the future?
I've been a peace activist my whole life, working for this. I do this. This is what I do every day, 24/7. You can't do that without being an optimist. Sometimes it's really hard, and I struggle with it. There are days when I lapse into pessimism, and I try not to allow myself to do that for more than 24 hours. Sometimes it's really, really hard. I've been demonstrating my whole life about different things since I was 12 years old. I've been going to demonstrations, and I hate demonstrating. Every demonstration I go home, I come back feeling depressed, which is really horrible. But I always say, if they give a demonstration, I have to go. I got to be there. I'm demonstrating for the families of hostages now, not for myself, for them, to be there with them. But I come home depressed, because rather than seeing 1 million people on the street, I see 10,000 people on the street, and that depresses me.
Do you think the protests happening in this country right now are having a positive, tangible impact, or are they hurting the cause?
It's difficult for me to judge. I really don't know. My impression is that it's hurting.
And why would that? Why is that your impression?
I don't know. Here's the complex part of it. I imagine that the protests are directing the protests mainly against the Biden administration, not really against Israel, or on the other side, not really against the Palestinians, but against the Biden administration. And here we're getting into murky and dangerous waters, because the most dangerous person on this planet is Donald Trump. And Biden, with all of his good parts and all of his faults, must win the elections in November. It is too dangerous for Donald Trump to be president of the United States again. And the war in Gaza is hurting Biden's chances of winning those elections. And that's a major concern for me. And I don't know if the protests are sending a message to Biden that will help him, or they're encouraging people who should vote for Biden who won't vote for Biden. And this is the perspective on which I view those protests.
Gershon, I love talking with you. I think you're a great man. And the reason I say that is because you are a voice of reason in a sea of madness, a sea of tribalism, toxicity, bias. This is a complicated subject, and people have to approach it with a clear eye on what's coming from both sides of it. There are legitimate beefs on both sides. There are legitimate atrocities on both sides. I think we all agree that there needs to be some peaceful solution, and I think it's going to be people like you who are fair and balanced to help us get there. So I appreciate everything you said today and what you do, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you. It was a great discussion. Okay. My pleasure.
Take care.
See you again soon.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.